going to give us some information on the Alpha Phi fraternity for the county.
President Lewis, Brothers of Alpha Phi Alpha, this southern area, California. I will discuss with you this evening some facts of historical interest, why and the wherefore of our fraternity, Alpha Phi Alpha. In the first place, the founders of this organization were actively enrolled at Cornell University. And I think you ought to know a little about the conditions and the times when they were students at Cornell. Now, of course, there was some prejudice at Cornell, and they encountered some of it, but that didn't deter them from pursuing their studies or coming together and meeting and enjoying camaraderie among themselves. The conditions over the United States were, in many instances, discouraging. There were several men of prominence in the United States who were traveling over the country and being widely quoted in the daily press, and they were attempting to push the Negro down on the bottom of the totem pole socially and keep him there. One of the men who was doing that was Senator Pitchfork Ben Tillman of South Carolina. Others were Vardaman, John Sharp Williams of Mississippi, Cole Blease of Georgia, and a number of others who were traveling over the country, usually in the northern states, and Tillman monopolized the lecture platform in as many northern states as would invite him. They were vilifying, maligning, and defaming the Negro. A lot of that sentiment permeated the campuses of higher institutions of learning, and employment, for the most part, was a menial character. Very few of our people were able to get beyond the menial occupations. The students were servants in hotels, cafes, dining car, the Pullman car. And if it hadn't been for those forms of employment, we wouldn't have had many Negro doctors, lawyers, and other professionals. And it was a situation that caused most of the students to deny themselves while they were going through school. And most of the, that is, all the founders were a little older than the average student of today. And they were men of wide experience. They had been matriculated with other higher institutions of learning. For example, Jewel Kelly was first at Rensselaer Polytechnic before he finished his engineering course at Cornell. And when he came out as an engineer, he couldn't get a job in his profession. He finally landed in the tax department of the state of New York, and he and his employment were based in Albany. Incidentally, Kelly lived in Troy, which is right next to Albany. And Kelly's home was built before the American Revolution. And it was on the bank of the Hudson River. And he could sit in the window of his home and see the governor's yacht go down the Hudson River. I was a guest at his home for 2 or 3 days, and I marvel at it because it had so many built-in features. And Kelly and his wife wouldn't travel together. One of them always aimed to be there. because they had so many antiques and they were afraid of the house being burglarized. And all the bedrooms on the second floor had two doors. So in colonial times, when the British came, they could make their exit one way or the other. And Kelly's father had been a veteran in the Union Army during the Civil War. He has a fine background of American heritage. Now, Ogle was in the capacity of a secretary under Senator Warren, who was chairman of the Appropriations Committee under the Wilson administration. Murray, he took agriculture and he taught school in Armstrong Technical High School in Washington, D.C. Tandy was very fortunate. His father was a prosperous contractor in Kentucky, and Tandy was very well fixed financially. And he claimed that all of the N students, if you know what N means, were hanging on his coattails because he used to borrow money from him. And some of them were very slow about paying him back. Callis was probably the most interesting as to a career. Callis won a scholarship in upstate New York, and that's the way he got to Cornell. Callis's father was an AME Zion minister. He was an elderly man, and when Callis finished his college work, why he began to think about taking the course in medicine. And Callis was a very persistent fellow. He was steady. He set his goal high, and he was always working toward it. So Callis got to Chicago, and he began to study medicine. And he was married, and he had two daughters. And that was his first marriage. And he had a struggle. He had a position in a laboratory, a pathological laboratory in Chicago. And that's the way he was earning his way through the school. But his first job in Chicago, he was a janitor. Well, Callis would work a few months, maybe 2 or 3 quarters, and then he'd have to drop out of school. He was a delicate man, and sometimes he would be ill, other times he would be in financial circumstances that prevented him from continuing. And he told me, you know, medicine in those days was a 4-year course. Then you served 1-year internship in a hospital. And if you were successful in your grades and proficient, why, then you were eligible to be licensed to practice medicine. That made 5 years. And he told me that it took him 11 years to go through medicine, become qualified. And you have to respect that kind of perseverance. He just kept at it until he finished. He was delicate, sometimes in poor health, and sometimes he was financially strapped. Now, Chapman was older than the majority of the founders, and he had a little dining hall there at Cornell that he rented out, and he had a little brickyard too. He was more or less of a businessman, and Chapman was one of the staunch members of the original 7. Murray, as I said before, he took agriculture. Murray was always of a sort of a nervous type. His speech was quick, and he was sometimes a little impulsive. But the man that was socially the most popular of all the founders, I believe, was George B. Kelly. Kelly was of small stature, and everybody liked him. He got along with everybody. He and Callis were not close together by incidentally. They, of course, would speak, exchange the grip, and so on like that. But in later life, they were a little bit cool toward each other. Not anything serious. Now, I guess I have told you about all the original 7 because I thought maybe you'd like to know a little about them. And you could keep these in mind and have something to take home with you that you didn't have before you came here. Now, the founders, all except Tandy, they had to scuffle for a living. And 3 of them worked in so-called white fraternity houses. They overheard conversations and they put the pieces together bit by bit. They had some wisdom of their own, of course, and some original ideas. And they, with the other founders, came together and fashioned a fraternity that would meet their purpose and would enable them to carry out a program. Now, you know, one of the things that influenced them greatly was the Niagara movement. That was a meeting of Negro male from 17 states who had been invited. Only those from 14 states showed up. And when they went for hotel accommodations at Buffalo, New York, they were denied. So they crossed the river, St. Lawrence River, and held their meeting in Canada. That's why they call it the Niagara Movement, because it was up there on the other side of the Niagara River. Now, that was in 1905. Du Bois had called that meeting, and they made a pronouncement at the conclusion of that meeting that Negroes in the United States, they called them Negroes then, they call them blacks now, and some of the white folks used to call them colored because that sounded a little softer, you know. Anyhow, they framed a pronouncement to the effect that Negroes would be satisfied with nothing less than their full rights of manhood and citizenship in the United States. There was a great controversy raging. One school of thought was led by Dr. call him Brother Du Bois. He advocated higher education. And the other school of thought was headed by the late Dr. Booker T. Washington of Tuskegee, advocating industrial education. Now, both of them differed, you might say almost violently, on the great social questions of the day. They couldn't agree on that. And at times, I guess they weren't in agreement even as to what time of day it was. But nevertheless, that controversy kept up hot, heavy, and wide until the death of Booker T. Washington. Now, while that was going on, the Negro population of the United States had become slightly prosperous in the wake of the Spanish-American War. And at the turn of the century, more young men and young women of our race had found it convenient to enter higher institutions of learning. At the turn of the century, there were between 7,000 and 8,000 Negroes in the United States. That's an estimate, who held degrees from higher institutions of learning. And most of them were teachers and members of the cloth, that is, the ministers. A few had entered the other professions, but we didn't have very many in the other professions. They had only two national organizations at that time. The National Negro Business League, organized under the urging of Dr. Booker T. Washington of Tuskegee. And then they had the Afro-American Council, which was formed about 1903. That didn't last very long. The other organizations in the United States that were attempting to do things racially and interracially were the churches, the lodges, so-called secret orders, and the minister was still considered the head of the flock. And sometimes when a Negro professional man, like a doctor of medicine, would locate in a community, he'd become what they call the leading Negro at that time. That was a term that we called some of our men who'd had advantages. Now, the Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity came into existence at a time when these conditions prevailed. Alpha Phi Alpha is not the first Greek letter society among Negroes in the United States. The first one was formed in 1904. The leader of the group that started that was Dr. Henry Minton, who started life as a pharmacist and later became superintendent of Mercy Hospital in Philadelphia. Maybe Dr. Ballard might have met him. And he got together 6 men, 4 doctors of medicine, 3 doctors of dental surgery. And they met in the front parlor of Dr. Howard, who was reputed to be the first Negro to graduate from the Harvard Medical School. And they laid the foundation for the organization of Sigma Pi Phi, which some of you have probably come across and know today as the Boule. It's a very prestigious fraternity. It's exclusive, not from the standpoint of snobbishness or anything like that. It has a social action program. It seeks no publicity, but it is involved in every community, in the activities of that community, directly and indirectly. It's an organization that when it started out, its membership was restricted. They kept it small until they could become a compact, cohesive organization, one that could function in unison. And the leaders of our race, many of them members of Alpha Phi Alpha, were leaders in the Sigma Pi Phi fraternity. I am not here to advertise or praise that organization, but I will mention that men like Dr. Du Bois, Kelly Miller, Emma J. Scott, Ernest Just, who was there were only 3 outstanding biologists in the world, and Ernest Just was one of them, Robert Vann, and a number of men like that, Dr. Daniel Handel Williams, the man who performed the first surgery on the human heart, and the patient lived. He was also a member. And there were men, leaders of thought and action, quietly. And it's a very beautiful organization. And I'm not talking about it because I happen to be a member, but I've been in it about 62 years. So I know where I must speak. And it's here in Los Angeles. But that was the first Greek letter society that we had. Now, Alpha Phi Alpha was the first undergraduate Greek letter society. See, the Boule is composed of men who've been out of school a number of years and who have their degrees and who demonstrated their proficiency in the communities in which they reside. So a lot of the members of Alpha Phi Alpha happen to belong to that too, the Boule. Now, you probably remember Algernon B. Jackson, who was head of the public health and hygiene of Howard?
Yeah.
He was one of the founders of it. And the two organizations have worked very harmoniously. Each respects the other. And so that being organized in 1904, and the Niagara movement taking place in 1905. The next big organization to be formed was in 1906, and that was Alpha Phi Alpha. And the men of Alpha Phi Alpha had been influenced by the Niagara movement, Callis especially. And Callis had the privilege of riding with Dr. Du Bois to Epsilon chapter in Michigan, Ann Arbor, Michigan. And he was so impressed with Du Bois that he was one of his disciples up until the time of his last breath. They were all influenced by the Niagara movement. When the founders came together to organize Alpha Phi Alpha, Poindexter was a secretary to one of the faculty members in the agricultural college. And he was older than all the rest. He was the leader that brought them together for the study club. And Poindexter, when they proposed a fraternity, you see, George B. Kelly kept hammering on the idea of a fraternity. So did Kinkle Jones and two of the other founders. Poindexter openly stated, he said, he told them they weren't ready for that kind of an organization and he didn't approve of it. So he withdrew. Eventually, they not only organized a fraternity, but they incorporated it so that they would have authority and power to issue charters. And in 1906, Alpha Phi Alpha came into being. Now, while they were busy drafting a constitution, Callis kept insisting on a social action program. And the provision in the preamble of the General Constitution that says, I quote, destroy all prejudices, end of quote, that is attributed to Callis. And that is the basis, the foundation on which we can base all our public programs and justify our public programs of education, guidance, and uplift. Just that phrase in the preamble of the General Constitution. Callis insisted, and he got that in there. Then the students of Cornell, of course, were men who'd had experience in other institutions of learning. They traveled over the country. They were a set of men who each one was different than all the others, but they had the ability to come together, to agree on a common goal and pursue it accordingly. What they were after when they started was to make conditions better at Cornell for the Negro students who came after them. But when Callis got this provision in the preamble of the General Constitution, they saw that they could do more than that. And they laid their plans accordingly. Now, coming back to the founders again, I have to give you a little personal touch about them because I knew every one of them. I've enjoyed the hospitality of the homes of some of them, and they were a very interesting set of men. They weren't perfect. They had their faults, and they were human beings and all like that. And sometimes they'd get angry and they had temper and they'd argue among themselves, but they could always get together in a peaceful manner on the big things of life. That's exactly what they did. Ogle was a sort of I can't call him an elder statesman, but he guided him a great deal in parliamentary procedure because he was on the staff of Senator Warren, who was chairman of the Appropriations Committee in the Wilson administration. And Ogle knew politics. Ogle came to Cornell from Wyoming. He's probably the one that lived farthest away. He came from Wyoming. And when Ogle graduated and got a job, he got a job at Western University at Quindaro, Kansas. You know where that is. And Bishop Vernon, who had been United States Register's Treasury, was then the president of Western University. And, in those days, the salaries of the Negro teachers wasn't very high. Ogle got $40 a month and some accommodations, probably one meal and a place, a room to sleep in. And $40 a month in those days was quite good for a man on his first teaching job. So Ogle smoked cigarettes. He thought he'd rather smoke here than hereafter, so he was smoking a cigarette and crossing the campus. And Bishop Vernon saw him, and he did what the boys called climbing him. So Ogle was astounded. It surprised him, see? So Ogle, right then and there on the campus, quit the job and told Vernon what he could do with it. So Ogle quit. I tell you that to show you how independent he was. And you touch Brother Norman, tell him to wake up. Well, Tandy took architecture. And he is credited with being the architect for St. Philip's Episcopal Church in New York that had property worth well over $1 million. It's built somewhat on a cathedral style, and then they had the parish house next to it. And you remember Shelton Hale Bishop, perhaps. His father was a priest, and Shelton succeeded his father. Tandy, having taken architecture, he designed several pins, and they were submitted to Stephen Lane Folger of Massachusetts, Boston, Massachusetts. And one of the design was selected, and Tandy had the first pin of Alpha Phi Alpha, beautiful pin. Coming down the street, he saw Murray, and Murray wanted to hold it, and he wanted to examine it. So Tandy let him take it, and Murray dropped it in the snow. And the first pin of Alpha Phi Alpha was lost to the world. Murray was a nervous sort of person, see. And I just tell you those things to show you, give you a little personal glimpse of the founders. Now, the founders had no guidelines, as I told you before, and they overheard things in the white fraternity houses where they worked, and they had an idea of an organization that was going to make it better for our people. And so they shaped the organization and its program accordingly. Now, they felt, after they got going, that they could do more than just make it better for Negro students who would come to Cornell after they had graduated. And they began to strengthen their fraternity. And Eugene Kinkle Jones set up one or two chapters, and we set one up in Toronto. That chapter was composed of students from the Caribbean, the West India Islands, as you call them. And of course, when they graduated, they went back home, and that chapter became inactive. And I guess it's still inactive, but it must be kept on the list. After we were organized, we noticed that several other groups were watching us, and presently other fraternities came into existence, and we were under their constant observation. Now, we held our conventions in December because we didn't want the undergraduates to lose time from their studies. It was vacation time. And in those days, most of the members were undergraduates. And you call them college brothers now. And they had to cut the garment according to the cloth that they had. So if they stayed away from their residences or their homes for 3 or 4 days, they could pick up their studies, because examinations came, in a good many instances, a short time after New Year's. And we didn't want them to lose too much time from their studies. So we met in the Christmas vacation. And all these other organizations observing us, they were newly formed, and they began holding their national conventions during the Christmas holidays. In due time, we established a journal, and pretty soon all the others established a journal, even the sororities. And short time after that, we had a fraternity song. Then all the other fraternities and sororities began to have a song and sing too. Now, the man who composed Alpha's song, I think that is the music, John Irby. I believe he's still up in San Francisco now. But A.L. Simpson, who wrote the words, he passed away many years ago. Both of them were students at Wilberforce. That's where the song about Phi Alpha originated. And not long ago, before he passed away, Dr. Sylvester Smith of this city sang the Alpha song for me. He was a Kappa, but he sang our song because he heard those men practicing this song at Wilberforce so much that he learned it just from hearing it. And one night at a meeting with Boulay, he sang the song for me to show that he knew it. Now, all of them had a journal. Then we established a public program. Every one of them, including the sororities, inaugurated a public program. And finally, we established, that is, we produced a written history, a development of Negro college life. The first authentic record of a group of Negro men of college grade in the world. Alpha Phi Alpha put that history out. And that history going in the libraries of the schools and colleges all over the United States. You'll probably find it in the Smithsonian Institute, the Congressional Library. You'll find that history in the South Pacific. We got chapters there. You'll find it in Africa. You'll find it in European countries. You'll find it over in England. That history is a constant refutation of the false allegations of Anglo-Saxon intellectual superiority over people of African descent. That's what the history means. And, Negro students standing on the threshold of life, halting youth standing on the threshold of life, looking for direction and guidance. And that history is a beacon. When they read that history and they see the achievements of black men, it'll be an incentive for them to prepare themselves. It'll give them hope and it'll give them courage. And that's what Alpha Phi Alpha is all about. Now, the history is a long effort to get the history of Alpha Phi Alpha. Roscoe Conklin Giles was one of the best general presidents we ever had. He was the second general president. Roscoe Conklin Giles was an active ab initio, you might say. He is the one that spearheaded the movement alone at start for entrance into Cook County Hospital in Chicago, because they had a barrier against people of our complexion that was horse high, hog tight, and bull strong. It took a long time to break down the barriers and get in Cook County Hospital. It's a teaching hospital now, you know. And you probably read Leonidas Berry's history that he put out here a couple of years ago. Well, then you know what it is. Well, I was Midwestern vice president at the time, and I visited the chapter at Columbus, Ohio, Kappa chapter. And in discussing fraternity matters, there was a young man that raised his hand. He said, "Who are the founders of Alpha Phi Alpha?" I named him. He said, "You're wrong." Well, now I'm a general officer here, and I'm supposed to know who the founders are. So it astonished me. So I said, "No, I'm not wrong." "Yes, you are." Well, I said, "I'll prove it to you." So after the meeting, I went out and I sent a night telegram to George B. Kelly, and I sent another one to Murray. In the morning, I had the answers. Each one of them named a different set of founders. So I thought maybe this young fellow knows something. So then, after some investigation, I found that the founders were not in agreement as to who the founders were. So then I proposed that a founder of Alpha Phi Alpha be present at every general convention, because there's a little radicalism that was creeping up, and I thought they'd have, if a founder was present, you'd keep them on the right track. And I had some opposition in the general organization on that. I hate to talk about people after they passed away, but the general secretary and the general treasurer didn't want to spend any money. So I finally got it through. George B. Kelly was the first guest founder at the 17th convention in New York, 1924. And I thought that was fine, because Kelly was actually the most popular of all the founders. And the next convention met in Detroit. That was the 18th convention. And I invited Murray to be the guest founder at the 18th convention. When we changed cars in Chicago, Callis got on the train. Callis and Giles. So Callis came over and sat with me until we got to Detroit. We rode into Detroit together. So I asked Callis, I said, if he would share the platform with Murray. He said yes. So after the convention got underway, I had Murray give his version of Alpha Phi Alpha, the founding, the why, and the wherefore. And Murray named his set of founders. Then I had Callis give his version, and Callis named a different set of founders. So I announced to the convention that we ought to write the history while it was possible to do so with some degree of accuracy. I said, these men are getting old and their memory is getting dim. I said, we've got to do something now and find out who the founders are. So we passed the motion that the history, that is, we proposed a motion that the history of Alpha Phi Alpha be written, reduced to writing. Now, Giles had tried to write the history once, but he had to, I forget just why he didn't go through with it. Garvin had outlined the history, and both of them had what they had written in their possession, but wouldn't surrender it. So we had to have a history. And when the motion looked like it was going to be passed overwhelmingly. Opposition, of which Piper and Evans had something to do with, they tacked on a rider on the bill, and I didn't think that was good for the fraternity. So while I was presiding, I had to maneuver it around so that the whole thing would be defeated, because I knew that that little rider they had on there wasn't good for the fraternity. Therefore, we had nothing so far. So Garrett Morgan came there, and he got, and I'm going to tell you the story of Garrett Morgan before we leave tonight, because it's too funny not to tell you. Garrett Morgan got up. He wouldn't take that coonskin coat off. He wore that in the meetings, you know. So, and he had his hair all brushed back, you know. And Morgan got up. He said, "I can see the value of the history. You brothers ought to be ashamed of yourselves." And he just shamed them into it. And they passed the motion that authorized the history, and they authorized Callis and Murray to write the history. Now, they couldn't agree on what time of day it was, but they wanted them to write the history, see? So Morgan offered $100. Now, that was a lot of money in those days. $100, my goodness. He's going to start off with that. So when the convention had adjourned, Callis got nervous about that $100. They wanted it so they could start. And all that summer, I was traveling, and I found Chapman. He was teaching way down in Florida. He had sort of disappeared from the other founders, and they didn't even know where he was. So I found him, and I told him about the fraternity and how it had grown since he left Cornell, and he came to the next convention as a guest founder. Well, we kept on. And the $100 wasn't forthcoming. And finally, it got time for the next convention in Richmond, Virginia. And we didn't have the $100, and the history hadn't been started. And that was part of my agenda as president of the organization, see? And I'm coming down there without anything done about it. So, just before the convention opened, Morgan came. He appeared. He had that coonskin coat on too, you know, and that was his trademark. So he came up, said, "Brother Canon," I said, "Yes." Says, "I promised $100 the last meeting in Detroit." He said, "You know, I've had financial reverses. I couldn't get that $100. He said, "But I got $50 cash here. And I'm going to give that to the convention if you let me get up and explain it to him." I said, "Sure, you can explain it." I took courage for a man to do that and come across the country at his own expense. Well, he got up and he explained why. You know, Morgan was quite prosperous at one time. Incidentally, he's the man that invented the stop and go light that you use in traffic. And he invented the gas mask that they used in World War I and all like that. And he's probably the only man in Alpha Phi Alpha who didn't finish high school. He was an honorary member. And, you know, he wound up his remarks by slapping $50 in green bills on the table. And if you've ever heard or witnessed a revival meeting in a fundamentalist church, you had it that day. They cheered, they clapped their hands, they hollered, they sang, they cried. And while they were doing all that, I whispered over to one of the stalwarts of the convention. I said, "Make a motion right quick that the president be empowered to appoint a historian." And that went through. And we had Morgan's $50. And then the history was authorized. So after the convention had adjourned, this was down in Richmond, see, and incidentally, the president of the Chamber of Commerce of Richmond, Virginia, came out and sat on the platform beside me and delivered the welcome address. Now, that's the old Bourbon aristocracy of Virginia. And I thought this is a new day short. And the secretary of the Urban League, one of our folks, when he presented me in front of this president of the Chamber of Commerce of Richmond, he says, "This is the first time that a cannon has been heard in the capital of the old Confederacy since 1865. I didn't know it to continue sitting there or not, see? Well, anyway, he took it all in stride, and he didn't go on the platform till I got there to show you the culture and the manners of the old Bourbon aristocracy of the South. See, they were not as rabid and violent as a lot of the people in the North thought. He stood in the center aisle, just in front of the rostrum, and waited till I had arrived. And then he was presented, that is, I was introduced to him. He shook hands cordially, and we both went up on the platform together. And after he had given the welcome address, he waited until I had addressed the convention, and then he crossed the platform, shook hands, wished us the best of everything and a successful convention. And I thought, for a man in the South, I thought that was wonderful. And it was. Well, you know, after the convention had adjourned, I was standing on the sidewalk talking to a couple of the brothers, and a tall, taciturn sort of fellow came to me, and he said he was a high school teacher in Washington. His name was James N. Saunders. He was a brother. And he talked in a sort of a monotone. He was a peculiar type. He was so stern looking, and I thought maybe his face hurt him. And you know, he looked at me. He said, "You appointed a historian yet?" I said, "No." "Well, you're going to appoint one?" I said, "Yes." "I'm not trying to tell you who to appoint, but before you make your decision, I just ask you to see Dr. Wesley." I said, "Now, who's Dr. Wesley?" He said, he's the head of the history department at Howard University." I said, "I'll promise you that I'll see Dr. Wesley, but I've got to go down to North Carolina on a mission. When I come back after New Year, I'll see Dr. Wesley." He says, "I'll take you up to see him." I thanked him and told him that I would prefer to go alone. So after I had returned to Washington, I went up to the campus of Howard University, and after inquiring from several students, I finally got the location of Dr. Wesley's classroom. It was on the second floor, and I found the building, and I entered his classroom. He was registering new students, and he was discussing their courses and telling them the why and the wherefore and so on like that. And I had never seen Wesley before. I had had a letter from him 2 or 3 years before that, but I didn't know Wesley. I watched him there registering those new students. And in 5-10 minutes time, I decided that he is the man that I'm going to appoint to write the history of Alpha. So there was something about him and the way he went about things, and the questions, the way he answered them, and the way he discussed and changed the mind of this student and made suggestions to that one. I thought, that's a man to write our history. Now, there were several in the convention who wanted to write the history, see, but I didn't consider that they were professional historians. And I wanted the best that we had, because I knew it would be a document to stand for all time in the future. Well, when the students he was interviewing had gone, Wesley was alone then at his desk, and I walked over and introduced myself. I told him my mission there. He said, well, I couldn't think of it. He said, I'm too busy. So some more students came in. I took a seat across the aisle. And when he'd finished with those students, I went up and tackled him again. He says, you see how busy I am? I said, yes, I see. But Alpha wants you. They want you to do this history. And that's why I'm here. Well, he couldn't do it. So I took off my heavy Minnesota overcoat again, threw it over the chair back, and I went over and sat down. The more I watched him, the more I was convinced that he was the man that had to do it. And I was just trying to figure out a way to, you might say, compel him to do it. See? And when he finished with the third group of students, he looked up and he saw me sitting over there, and he looked like it stunned him. So he rose and crossed the aisle and walked over and extended his hand. He says, I'll do it. I'll do it for the love of Alpha Phi Alpha. And then I reached over and grabbed my overcoat and left before he could change his mind. Now, that history, all the next summer, with correspondence and all, I helped him get a lot of the items in the first edition. Giles had to be satisfied that Wesley was trustworthy before he'd let his outline go. Garvin had to do the same. You knew Charles Garvin, didn't you?
Cleveland.
Yes. And, we found out so many things. Wesley went up to Ithaca, New York, and he looked over the dining room where Alpha was really formed, Mrs. Singleton's home. See, they met. She had a boarding house, and she was the aunt of Miles Page. And that was one of the things that sort of drew Page to the Alpha Phi Alpha, So Mrs. Singleton cooperated with him beautifully. And Wesley got a lot of the background and all, and she told him how the fellows would meet there and what they argued about and everything else. And that was interesting to Wesley. Then Wesley wrote to me and he wanted to know if I could help him out with pictures. So I had pictures of the early conventions, beginning with the 5th convention in Columbus, Ohio. And I bundled them all up and sent them down to him. And those pictures you see in the first edition of the history are the ones that I furnished Wesley. And then I wrote to different ones and persuaded them to write to Wesley and give him all the cooperation and material and everything else that he needed. And they responded beautifully. Now, Wesley started on the history. And in the 20th convention, he had a rough draft typewritten. And it was so impressive that B.A. Rose, who later became general president, Rose was very conservative, quiet, studious, scholarly. Rose was amazed too. And it took the convention by storm. And in 1929, Wesley came to Atlanta with the first printed edition of the history. And it had a beautiful paper cover. You remember it.
Mm.
And I guess for 3 or 4 hours, the brothers of the convention forgot the convention and they were autographing each other's history. And those histories for the first edition, some of them have 40, 50, 60 or more names written all over the flyleaf, the cover, and the pages. And those histories now are really collected items. I was going to bring one here tonight to show it to you, but I forgot it, Brown called for me a little sooner than I had expected. Now, that I want to tell you, am I tiring you out here? Well, I wanted to tell you about the story about Garrett Morgan. Garrett Morgan was a man that he had graduated from the School of Hard Knocks. He wasn't a college man. And he had, now Garrett Morgan is actually responsible for our history because he was the spark plug that set that meeting off in Richmond that authorized the history. Garrett Morgan was an employee of a sewing machine company in Cleveland. And whenever this company sold a sewing machine, he had to go out and set it up and get it and explain to the lady of the house how to run it and all like that. And then he would be sent out whenever one of them had to be serviced. So you remember these old time fur rugs that people used to have in their parlor? They were bearskin. Well, he had to go to service a sewing machine in a home of, hello. He had to go and service his sewing machine in a home where there were white people, of course. And in cleaning it and fixing it all up and adjusting it, he spilled some of the detergent that he used to clean it. And he didn't want the lady of the house to discover it, so he took his rags and he wiped it up off of this fur rug. And as he wiped it, the curl in that fur straightened. And Garrett was on his knees, and he was down there on his knees, and he just stared at it. 6 weeks later, he had taken that strong detergent to a chemist, had it analyzed, and Morgan's hair refiner came out on the market. It was one of the early hair straighteners. and Morgan made an awful lot of money on that, see, because it sold like wildfire, you know. And after they had used that and then bought some of this pomade they call Murray's or something like that, you know, why, and Garrett, to advertise it, he let his hair grow about this long, and then he brushed it right back, see? And it stood up like this, kind of high, and he brushed it back close to his scalp. And he looked like a sea lion when he's just breaking up through the wire, you know? And Morgan was quite a character with that coonskin coat and all. So he was a man who was naturally smart. As I said before, he invented this stop and go traffic signal. He invented the gas mask when they had that big mine explosion down in Ohio. He and his brother took those gas masks and rescued a whole lot of people. And that mask was used, a modification of it, in the trenches in World War I. And I was in World War I, so I know what I'm talking about, see? Now, I don't...
From the local Los Angeles chapters. By the way, this is November the 10th, I've been told. It said November the 8th, 1984. So at this time, brother, could you show all the brothers? Brother Canon's going to speak for a few minutes, and then we'll have a question and answer period. Brother Canon, if you wanted to start his act again.
Well, there are just two things I want to mention before I answer the questions. The first is that Alpha Phi Alpha is one of the earliest of our activist organizations. The Sphinx happens to be the second oldest journal among Negroes in the United States. Next, I would like to say that Alpha Phi Alpha 1917, while it was a small, weak fraternity, alone spearheaded the movement to establish an officers training school at Fort Des Moines, Iowa, for the training of Negro officers to officer Negro troops overseas in World War I. Prior to that time, we had only 2 regiments of infantry and 2 regiments of cavalry. And if a Negro went to enlist in the military, he was ushered into the quartermaster or the labor battalions. And we felt that we could stand up and hold our head high as citizens, and more especially as men, unless we served in combat units in World War I. And now, under the Wilson administration, we had a very hard time. That probably was the most prejudiced administration, as far as racial prejudice against Negroes was concerned, we ever had in the United States since emancipation. The South was in the saddle, and it made every bit of it uncomfortable for all of us. We had race riots in France in World War I, and after the war was over, they were continued in the United States, in Washington, Baltimore, in Chicago. I was in the Chicago riot, and we had them among the soldiers over in France. But, you know, finally, when they began to train Negro officers, we call them Negro officers, but they were officers who happened to be Negro. Now, you see, they weren't going to have any at all. But we kept hearing rumors of German agents going through the Southland as Bible agents, entering Negro homes and talking German propaganda. Now, we got no way of proving that, but it must have got back to Washington, because in a short time, Emmett J. Scott, Brother Emmett J. Scott, was appointed Assistant Secretary of War under Newton D. Baker. Therefore, we had representation from the top on down. Now, the other statement I want to make is this. In that first officers training school, 32 members of Alpha Phi Alpha stepped out front and center and received commissions as captains, first and second lieutenants in the United States Army, all because of what Alpha Phi Alpha started, the Beta chapter at Howard University in Washington, D.C. That was activism. And when they saw what they could do there, they spread out and extended their energy in other directions to break down discrimination. Now, I want to tell you one way, one of the reasons why our educational campaign caught on like it did. In those days, it was the go to high school, go to college campaign. In the smoker of the 12th convention in Chicago in 1919, we came together. A lot of us were veterans. Some of us were angry, and most of us were terribly resentful, all of us who'd had overseas service, because we had been subjected to discrimination. We had been in riots after the armistice was signed. We had to turn around in many instances and defend ourselves against Southern white soldiers. Now, in that 12th convention, they held a smoker the day before the convention opened. That smoker started early in the evening and it lasted way in the night. And the president of the local chapter presented the topic when they came together. And that was the topic for discussion after an hour of camaraderie and refreshments and so on like that. And they started to discuss the topic that he presented. And immediately, brothers all over that auditorium were jumping up and trying to get the floor to be recognized. They wanted to say something. And even the more timid brothers, the kind that sit through a whole convention, seldom say a thing. They were fighting to get the floor. And really, it was a refreshing spectacle because they were all stirred up. And in this smoker, there was a young brother named Bibb, Joseph Bibb. He was trying to establish a circulation for a little newspaper he was starting. It was called the Chicago Whip. Don't trade where you can't work. That was his slogan. And Bibb gained the floor. He was an old-time spread eagle orator. And he started by telling how the Negroes had been disfranchised in all the southern states. Not all of them, but most of them. And he told how all of the congressmen and senators from the southern states had been eliminated through disenfranchisement and enfranchisement. And then he said, we're coming back. And he told what was necessary for us to come back and hold public office and vote and exercise our full rights of citizenship. And they cheered and hollered, and clapped their hands. They liked that kind of a speech at that time. Few of us there thought that what he advocated would come to pass in our time. But of course it has come to pass. And he elected men to Congress on the floor of that 12th convention. He elected them to Congress. He elected them to the United States Senate. And he put a black man in the White House that night. And of course, we cheered him because we hadn't heard anything like that. And we were all in the dumps anyhow, from what we had gone through the preceding year overseas. So, following Monday morning, when the convention opened, Brother Perry Jackson, who's now a retired judge in Cleveland, and Robert Martin, they were a Pi chapter in Cleveland. They got up in the convention and presented statistics showing that Cleveland had a population of 30,000 Negroes, and only one young man and 6 young ladies graduated from the city high schools. And then Herman Moore, who later became a federal judge in the Virgin Islands, he got up and moved that Alpha Phi Alpha inaugurate a movement to encourage young men and young women of our race to go to high school and to go to college. That was the beginning of the Go to High School, Go to College campaign. The motion passed, and Alpha was on its way. And all of our other educational programs have stemmed from and branched out from that. And that 12th convention in Chicago was really the most important convention we've ever had, because Alpha rededicated itself to activism. And today you find the sons and daughters, even the grandchildren of members of Alpha Phi Alpha in the front line, in the front ranks, fighting for our rights of full citizenship under the Constitution of the United States. Now, coming back to what Bibb prophesied, we have judges on the municipal, state, federal courts, federal benches, on the Circuit Court of Appeals. We've got mayors of some of our largest cities. They have one in the cabinet of the President of the United States, and one of our brothers sitting on the bench of the United States Supreme Court, Brother Thurgood Marshall. And the predictions that Brother Bibb made in that 12th convention are now a reality. It gave Negroes a shove, it made them go forward, and it made them go upward. And the achievements of Martin Luther King, of Jesse Owens, of Thurgood Marshall, and of Joseph Bibb, who later became the public safety director for the whole state of Illinois, if you please. All those have come to pass and they are a reality. You see what Alpha Phi Alpha has done. We have lifted ourselves by our own bootstraps. We've achieved, we've accomplished, we've succeeded. Now, the final point I want to make is this. Attorney Charles P. Howard, whose son later became an Eastern Vice President several years ago. Attorney Charles P. Howard had made a record as a football star on Drake University's football team. When he finished, he was so popular, he opened an office in the city of Des Moines. And he had almost more practice than he could handle. In due time, he became city attorney. Now, Howard heard about the go to high school, go to college campaign, but he didn't know who was sponsoring it. And he kept making inquiry. And finally, he learned that it was the program of Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity. So he recruited a group of men from the University of Iowa and from the other university there, the Aggie School. He recruited a group of men and held them together, except two who defected. He held them together until he could get a petition for a chapter okayed by the general organization. Not because they wanted to be a fraternity, but because they wanted to participate in that program. And he figured the young men and young women of Iowa needed just such a program as that. So, in due time, David M. Crosswaite and I were delegated to go to Des Moines and set up Alpha Nu chapter of Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity, which we did. And then the go to high school, go to college campaign under Howard's direction spread all over the whole state of Iowa. And one of the young men that we initiated as a charter member that night was Frederick D. Patterson, who in later years became the president of Tuskegee Institute. I thought you ought to know that.
Yes, was Duke Slater before that time or later?
Slater was right about that time. I don't remember the years, but
I thought he wasn't part of that channel.
no, he wasn't a part of that chapter. At the time we set it up, Duke Slater didn't. He wasn't affiliated with it. But I'll tell you who wanted that group and who tried to get it away from Alpha was Archie Alexander. He was later on the grand polemarch of Kappa Alpha Psi, but Howard held them together. And Archie had to find other men. Now I'll answer your questions.
You mentioned before that Sphinx was the second journal in the United States. What was the first?
I don't know. But I get my information from Michael Price because he wrote and told me that he had done some research work, and I never asked him which the first was. Incidentally, I might mention that in a safe deposit box downtown, my wife has the second book printed in America, and she has several other books. I don't know who's going to get them when she passes away, but they're valuable documents. Well, I'll answer any other questions you have now.
Did you know who the first was?
I think it's the crisis, the NAACP. Sure.
Christ?
Yes, that's what it was, a crisis. I remember now, he told me.
I thought so. I went to it.
Yes.
You forgot to mention Senator Brooks too. We got up with
Yes.
going up the line, forgot him.
And Brooke, incidentally, was not elected by black folks, he was elected by white folks. As Attorney General first, and then as United States Senator. He was good.
He used to come to the convention and sit in his uniform when he's an undergraduate at Howard.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember.
That reminds me of a speech that Fred Douglass made in Boston. He was the greatest champion of civil rights and human liberty in his day that the United States had. Boston, you know, was a mecca were immigrants from Ireland. So there were two Irishmen, so the story goes, who were sitting up in the front seat, and the movement for women's suffrage, was gaining momentum. And they got Frederick Douglass to speak for women's suffrage. And nearly all the audience was white. So these two Irishmen from Ireland were sitting there and listened to Frederick Douglass. And one of them whispered to the other, "He's half nigger." And the other one says, "Well, what could a whole nigger have done?" Douglass was a member of Alpha Phi Alpha. He was made posthumously in the convention that met in Baltimore in 1922. S.S. Booker was the general president, and he led the pilgrimage to the last resting place of Frederick Douglass. And I remember what Booker said. He used similar words that Pershing did when he led the American troops over in France to the grave of Lafayette. Booker said, "Douglas, we are here." And the Kappa Alpha Psi and some of the others had to criticize Alpha for admitting a dead man. Now, incidentally, I'll tell you how we worked in the early days. Lionel Artis, maybe some of you know him. He used to be the YMCA secretary in Indianapolis, Indiana. He was personnel officer in my regiment in France. And he got to be the editor of the Journal of the Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity. One day, Lionel Artis, thinking he knew me well enough to ask me a question, wrote to me and asked me for helpful information so he could get his journal up and going. And I gave him the information freely because I figured the more we help them or any other Greek letter society, the better it is for us. If we help them, we're indirectly helping ourselves. So I helped him, and I established a committee among the leaders of the other organizations so that if we ever had a problem, I could take it up with them instead of having to listen to complaints from chapters and so on like that. And I had very good cordial relations. And the other day I received a beautiful letter from Earl B. Dickerson, who was a past grand full mark of Kappa Alpha Psi. He was one of the great civil rights lawyers in his day. And, I have kept in touch with some of them, and they keep in touch with me. And Alpha Phi Alpha was a friendly organization. And we didn't recognize any competition at all because competition can only occur as between and among like organizations. And ours was different from all the rest. So we didn't recognize competition. And I used to be welcome as a guest at Kappa houses, just like I would be at Alpha house. Now I'll answer your questions.
Hubert Humphrey was made an honorary Alpha.
Yes.
You know anything about that?
Yes, he was.
I know he's made in Chicago.
He was made under.
And I know you know him.
Well, incidentally, Hubert Humphrey was a personal friend of mine. When the Minneapolis Fair Employment Practice Commission was established, he appointed me on that commission, which was the first commission of its kind on municipal level in the United States. He and I were personal friends. And one day when I was in Washington, I visited him when he was vice president. He called in we asked him first. We were to a fundraising dinner at the Armory. They had about 6,000 people there. So when we had finished the dinner, we went down the aisle until we were standing opposite the head table, some distance, of course. And we waited until we got Humphrey's eye. And he said, come on up. So when we got near the table, he told the Secret Service men to let these men by. Said they're from my hometown. And the white people on the edge of the aisle were handing us program and wanted us to get into autographing, but we couldn't do that. So we went up there and we said, how can we get in touch with you tomorrow without having to go through all those people in the front office? He says, I'll give you my home telephone number. Call me at 7 in the morning. Called him at 7 in the morning. That he lived over in Chevy Chase. That's in Maryland. And that afternoon, about 2 o'clock, we walked in, passed all these people in the front offices, and Humphrey entertained us the rest of the afternoon. He had over 200 appointments on his book scheduled, maybe 2 or 3 months ahead. But he didn't care about that. He called in his personal photographer, and he had our pictures taken together. And I was with Bill Seaburn, who's an Alpha man, and he was the deputy assistant to the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture. So he gave me a set of cufflinks with the seal of his office. And then he said, Ray, take these back to your wife. And he gave her a bracelet with these little spangles with the seal of his office. And when Humphrey would come through anywhere I was in the country, why, he made it a point to see me, and I made it a point to contact him. He was a very interesting man.
Well, how did he get me out for that?
Under Newsom.
I mean,
I think he was taken in under Newsom.
Did he come in the Pledge Club and the Sphinx Club like the rest of us?
He was taken in as an honorary member. And
he showed up at the convention.
Yes,
They inducted him at the
Yeah.
Chicago convention.
and he appreciated coming in. He told me once, he came from here in South Dakota, where they had only a handful of Negroes, and there were a lot of Indians around there, the Rosebud Reservation. And Humphrey's father was quite a local politician. Humphrey's mother was Swedish and his father was Scotch. And his father had a drugstore. If any of you remember the neighborhood drugstore, most of them had a soda fountain. And there was a young lady used to come in every afternoon and get ice cream at the soda fountain. She was the one that became Mrs. Humphrey. Childhood sweetheart, But Humphrey told me that his father told him there was no difference in people, that color didn't make any difference. And they had 2 race questions out there, a little one for the handful of Negroes that are there and one for the Indians that are there. And Humphrey said he was brought up to know that there wasn't any difference in people. And when he was a student at the University of Minnesota, and also when he taught there, he would have some of our folks come to his home for Sunday dinner. And he was the friend of the average man, too. Now, the campus cop was a great big fella named Ryan. Had a foot on him about this long. We didn't have much to do except at the football games, keep order. Every afternoon, about the middle of the afternoon, he'd come down the street and stop in front of Humphrey's home. The front door would open and Humphrey would come out. And he and Humphrey would have a long talk, maybe an hour and a half. And everybody wondered what Humphrey saw in that cop. So, this is Brother Humphrey now. And when Humphrey got to be mayor of Minneapolis, that cop got to be the chief of police. They cleaned up the city of Minneapolis of corruption and graft. Nobody went to jail. Everything was done nicely. In 3 or 4 years, they had a citation as one of the cleanest cities in the United States. That's the way he worked. If any of these officers have been doing things in their district or on their beat that they shouldn't have done. He gave all of them a chance to be transferred somewhere else in the city. Nobody went to jail. That's Hubert Humphrey. What's the next question?
Remember Paul Robeson?
Yes,
Mr. Plower?
yes. Robeson took law, and he couldn't connect up with the law firm like he wanted to. So he had a beautiful voice, and he had some natural talent for acting. He was a Phi Beta Kappa, and his mother died when he was about 12 years old. His father was a minister, Presbyterian minister. His father and he became just like this. And his father insisted on excellence. Didn't want him just to stand at the top of his class, but he must be excellent. And that's the kind of a bringing up that Robeson had. And Robeson's talent in the theater was recognized, and of course you know what his career amounted to. But he was a very good alpha man, and the last convention I saw Robeson at was, I think, in 1945 in Columbus, Ohio. He sang for us there without accompaniment. Who's next?
Brother Canon,
Yeah.
could you tell us something about like the time when you pledged and where it was and when it was, and how you got what year in Alpha's development you got into the term?
Well, one day, when I got into university, I was more a boy than I was a man. I had to stay there till I was 21 before they'd give me a degree from a professional school. So I peeked around and did a lot of extra things and got a lot of extra knowledge that I otherwise wouldn't have got. And I still have that that boyhood complex. My father would have liked it very much had I been a doctor of medicine. When I got over there and I got in the dissecting room, I stayed 15 minutes. I just couldn't take all those bodies over there. I took a degree as Bachelor of Pharmacy. Now, in 1911, I received a postcard from one of the Negro students. He, in those days, you know, they had these picture postcards. And on the back of it was a picture of a mule, a man pulling the halter this way and the mule backing up in the opposite direction. And it said on that card, "Come out, meet the fellas, have a good time, be persuaded." So I answered it and I went out to the meeting. Now, I saw men that had lived in Minneapolis and St. Paul pretty near all their life, but I'd never met them. You see, they were all grown-up men, so to speak, and I was still a high school boy. Anyway, I met them, and they formed a club called Pi Alpha Tau. And the leader of that group was James Lewis Titus, who was the uncle of W. Barton Bailey, who was the editor of the Sphinx. And Titus, they didn't know what he was, and he maneuvered around and got to be on the faculty of the College of Pharmacy at the University of Minnesota. And when I got qualified and he wanted to get off for a day or two, he used to arrange for me to go there and take his place at the University Hospital in the afternoon, at the pre-dispensary in the morning. He figured evidently that he could trust me. So Titus, he died out here. But I got into Alpha Phi Alpha after Pi Alpha Tau was made a chapter of Alpha Phi Alpha, when C.C. Middleton of Atlanta, Georgia, who was then a student in the medical school at the University of Michigan, he came and set us up on a Saturday night, April 6th, 1912. Now, I've been in Alpha Phi Alpha over 72 years.
You're a charter member of the chapter.
Huh?
You're a charter member of the chapter.
I'm a charter member of Mu Chapter, and I'm a charter member of Gamma Xi Lambda Chapter. And I've never had a moment to regret my tour of duty in this fraternity.
What was the first jewel that you met?
How?
What was the first jewel? Who was the first jewel that you met personally?
I don't recall the first one I met. It might have been George B. Kelly. I was a member of the 5th Convention in Columbus, Ohio. Kelly and Murray were both there because they were circulating, going all around to the convention and explaining things to different ones so that they would be familiar with the fraternal endeavor. And my chapter, Titus was the senior delegate to that convention. And I got up on the floor and announced that I was going to be the junior delegate. Everybody looked at me. So finally, they voted, and I was the junior delegate. And Bullock, Benjamin Bullock, the secretary of the chapter, whom some of you may have met when Alpha met down in Atlanta, Benjamin Bullock handed me my transportation on the railroad. We didn't use airplane in those days. And he said, Canon, I'm awful glad that you're going to be the junior delegate, because he says you're going away from home for the first time. You need it. Well, I came back as the general vice president. None of them ever said that I should go away from home again to get experience. So that's as long as I have been in the fraternity.
Brother Canon,
Yes.
what has been your most memorable experience in and out? You've been a member 73 years, and
Yes.
out of those 72, what has been the experience that you'll never forget?
Well, one of them that I won't forget was when I was Midwestern vice president. William T. McKnight, who was a student at University of Kansas. That's in Lawrence, Kansas. And he was then president of the chapter. They had a chapter house. It was located at 1101 Mississippi Street, right on the corner of a large, imposing structure. And he wrote and told me that they were having a problem and it was urgent. Could I come there? So I arranged to go. I had to go to Kansas City first, and then I transferred, went to Lawrence, Kansas. And when I got there, we held a chapter meeting. And we found that discrimination was being practiced against the Negro students. And they wanted to know if the vice president could help them overcome some of it at least. So I figured that we should never establish a chapter unless we will try to protect it. And on that basis, I took up the cudgel. So I sent McKnight up the next morning, make an appointment for me to see the chancellor. Chancellor was from South Carolina. And I knew then just about what I was up against. He refused to see me. So I sent McKnight back again that day and got the same answer. So McKnight went back that afternoon, and the chancellor said finally that he'd step out in the hall and greet Mr. Canon and shake hands with him. And I told McKnight, I said, Alpha don't transact its business in the hall. if I transact any business with him, it'll be in his office. So I made arrangements to take up residence at the chapter house until such time as I felt he'd find it convenient to see me. The NAACP had been quite active down there at that time. And I think his curiosity got the better of him. So late, I think it was that Saturday, he decided to see me. So I told McKnight, I said, now you come up there with me, because I wanted somebody else to hear what was said. So we got in the chancellor's office, and he thought that he would practice a little psychology on me, I guess. He thought he would throw me off balance by starting the conversation first. And he told me, he said, now, Mr. Canon, I'm from Quaker stock. I'm from South Carolina. My family freed their slaves long before the Civil War because they didn't believe in it. I knew then what I was up against, see. Now, to make matters worse, there was a young lady of our race attending the university who looked like Caucasian. And one of the good brothers of Alpha had taken her to the chancellor's reception. You know, there's a lot of Southern students there. And he got her out on the floor and started to dance with him. And of course, these Southerners, they resented that. So he said, now, the University Commons is a cafeteria. He said, if the students don't patronize it, it'll have to be closed because the university can't put out money to feed these students. He said, now, the Negro students are there out of all proportion to their numbers, their population. But now, I have called them in and suggested that we put a sign on the table, reserved, on 2 tables, and they use those tables. They don't do. They object to that. They say that's segregation. He said, "What do you think of it?" I said, "I not only think it's segregation, but I said, won't that lead to reserved things in other departments of school?" Not as long as he was chancellor. Then McKnight spoke up, and he pointed out discrimination in the classrooms and other places. See, and so then we went to the. We kept on with the chancellor until he finally had agreed that they could eat at any of these tables in the cafeteria. So we went to the Dean of Student Affairs, and I found out that the grant of that land, the conveyance that granted that land for educational purposes, had a provision in there against racial discrimination. There was a condition in the deed, see? And I think the chancellor suspected that maybe I had known that. So we proceeded along, and the Dean of Student Affairs, and as soon as we got in there, he was a little more cordial. I said, "What's the total enrollment?" He said, 3,000. I said, "How many Negro students do you think you have here?" He said, 200. Yet we're there out of all proportion to our numbers and population. He said, now, it was the Southern white students that were causing the trouble, the objection. You couldn't even buy a hot dog on the curbstone there out of these old piano box stands when I got down there. When I left there, Negroes could eat at any one of those tables. See? So I thought that McKnight and I had done a pretty good job. So when I got to the convention in Columbus, Ohio, and they found that out, they said, "Well, we want you for president." That's how I came to be general president. Because no president before me had ever taken steps to fight that discrimination. But armed with that information I got at Kansas, I went to Ohio University at Athens, Ohio. Not Ohio State at Columbus, but Athens, Ohio. Lawrence T. Young was a student in Phi Chapter, which was located at Athens, Ohio. The Board of Trustees had just adjourned when I got there. I was trying to fight against time, but the railroads are slow, you know. Now, the Board of Trustees had passed a rule, the effect of which was this: students who cannot enter the freshman class of the state universities, which they graduate from high school, cannot enter Ohio University. They were trying to eliminate the Negro students from West Virginia and Kentucky, bordering on Ohio. See? So I took that up, and that fight lasted for about 2.5 years. The student pastor took our side, and the university fired him. And Du Bois just begged for an opportunity to get in on it. And leading publications in the country were carrying accounts of it. And then we went to Cleveland, and we said, we're going to elect Perry Jackson in the state legislature. Perry Jackson, Alpha got behind him. And of course, now Alpha didn't do all this by themselves, you know, because we weren't able to perform miracles. But we got Perry Jackson to run for the state legislature, and we told him to make a beeline, try and cut the budget of Ohio University. Because the only thing a white man pays attention to is when you monkey with his pocketbook or try to cut his money. So, you know, Perry did the best he could, but of course, you know, we knew it was impossible for him to do that with all the influence and prestige and everything those politicians have in Ohio. But anyhow, we brought it to the attention of the public, and we fought down discrimination everywhere we found it. So that's the way I got to be the national president, because I was the first one that started anything like that. And Bishop Jordan, you know, we had a very good Alpha man in Los Angeles, Bishop Frederick D. Jordan. He was also a pretty good politician. He was a member of Alpha Phi Alpha, and he was the head of the Alpha Mu chapter at Evanston, Illinois. So one day he had me and Gordon Simpson of the St. Louis Urban League out to, when the Negro Sanhedrin was taking place, the head of the School of Theology at Northwestern University wanted to hear about this educational program Alpha's had. So Norman McGee went there, Gordon Simpson, and I. And they wanted to hear about our educational program. And after I had explained it to him, he said that we ought to extend that to everybody, white people and everybody, because he said it worked so nicely. And Jordan was the brains of that meeting. That it was an interracial meeting, and we had one or two noted artists there at the same time to intersperse the talks with musical selections and so on. Now, Jordan came to the convention when I was vice president. And he said, I am helping to form a slate. I said, what's a slate mean? I said, I don't see anything in the Constitution about a slate. He said, well, we're going to see if we can. He said, the committee has decided to make up a slate. And he said, now, we're interested to know which side of the Mississippi River your chapter is on. I said, why do you want that information? He says, well, we have heard that you're a candidate for vice president. So then McGregor was there from Alpha Delta, and they were getting ready to establish a far western vice presidency. And that would make 3 vice presidencies. And they were trying to figure out which one they'd give me. I said, well, Mississippi River runs right through the middle of my chapter. Well, how's that? I said, one night it meets in St. Paul on that side of the river. The next night it meets in Minneapolis on that side. Now I said, I hadn't decided to run, but you go back and tell your slate committee that I'm going to run now, and if I don't get one, I'll get the other. So that's how I got to be vice president. And I enjoyed the work. There was about, I guess a little over a third of the chapters in the whole jurisdiction were not active. And I promised to visit all the chapters in the Midwest, and I visited all but two. I couldn't make those. And they brought them to the convention, tax paid, active.
Raymond,
Yeah.
how did Sphinx get started? You were the first editor. Could you give some background on it?
Yes, this was in the sixth convention in 1913, December 1913. Charles Garvin was the president. And after he had appointed the committees and they were at work, he summoned me to his chair. And I went up to see what he wanted. And he said, the fraternity ought to have a journal. And I agreed with him. He said, now, he had a copy of the Hampton Student. And he said, here, you can take this copy of the Hampton Student and you can have that to go by. I had been appointed as a member of the printing committee, of which Julius C. McKelvey was the chairman. And the printing committee had its meeting and they went over the possibility of establishing a journal and voted favorably, and McKelvey made the report. And a journal was authorized to be known as the Sphinx. And that's the way it started. It was a sort of a pamphlet-shaped affair because we didn't have very much funds then, and most of the delegates had to pay their own expenses to the convention in those days. And sometimes the general officers had to bear most of their expenses because the budgets were small. So they set the subscription of the Sphinx at $1. They were to print 8 issues at first, but the money ran thin and they couldn't do it. And some of the brothers, it caught on quite well. But as is true in any large organization, unless there's some compulsive influence, why a lot of them would be reluctant to spend 50 cents for the subscription to the Sphinx. So in the next convention, we increased the grand tax from $1 to $1.50, and that half was the Sphinx's subscription. So they couldn't be active without subscribing to the Sphinx. Therefore, they had to take it and read it.
I had a question.
Yeah, what were C.C. Poindexter's reasons for not wanting the social literary organization to become a fraternity back in that time? And do you think his reasons were justified?
No, I don't. I think I think Poindexter was probably living in a little world of his own. He was older than the founders. Now, the founders, all of them were older than the average undergraduate of today. But Poindexter had taken the lead, and he kept this little group together as a study club. They liked to read poetry, discuss books, and give entertainments at the churches. And that was the extent that Poindexter thought they should go. So when George B. Kelly and Kinkle Jones and one or two others had the idea of a fraternity, Poindexter said to them, "You're not ready for that. Not ready for that." He didn't agree that they should have a fraternity. So when he saw that they were going to organize and become a college fraternity, he withdrew. he never joined the fraternity. And Murray never liked him either.
Brother Candace, since she said earlier that they argued, different people had different versions of who the founders were. How did they finally settle on the founders that we have?
They they decided when Wesley history was printed, the founders, as we knew them at that time, were contained in the first edition. Now, later on, I think it was somewhere around it was in the 40s. You know, it's kind of hard to remember some things. I've been in this 72 years, you know. I can't remember all. But when Wesley went to write the history, I went to New York to hunt up Kinkle Jones. He was the national secretary of the National Urban League. And he was a member of Alpha Phi Alpha. And in some mysterious way, a lot of the Urban League secretaries over the United States were Alpha men, because Jones was an Alpha C. Well, I saw Jones at one of the L stations in New York. There was a newsstand there, and he was buying a Hershey chocolate and a newspaper at that time. I remember that. So I said to Jones, I said, we're getting ready to write the history of Alpha Phi Alpha. A historian has been appointed. And I am here to ask you to write out your version of it and mail it to Dr. Wesley. Jones was a man who, when he got to be head of the National Urban League, he thought I came there to complain against the secretary that he had sent to Minneapolis, because I had complained to him in a letter. So he said, you write it, send it to me and I'll correct it. I says, I'm not a historian. He says, well, you write it. I didn't write it. See? And Wesley used the facts that he had and he wrote it. And Martin was declared to be one of the founders instead of Jones. Now, George B. Kelly and and Murray, they actually did know who the founders were. Murray wouldn't agree with Callis because Murray didn't want Poindexter for a founder. See? Well, now, for years, Martin was looked upon as one of the founders. Maceo Smith got to be the national president, and I think he had gotten well acquainted with Jones when he went to Columbia University. And Jones was then not in too good a health, and he's supposed to have had TB. I don't know whether he did or not. But in that convention, it happened to be down in Cleveland. It was the second Cleveland convention. And Wesley was there. And Jones came to that convention. Now, he was a big Urban League man. He didn't have time to come to the conventions prior to that time. You seldom saw him. He was a hard man to talk to after he got authority. And I was really surprised because they had told me that he was this, that, and the other, and he was reputed to have been the first initiate. And that's why we always considered him. So he stated that he was a founder, and he brought some evidence there. And Wesley, and George B. Kelly, and I think Maceo, and there was another founder there, I forget which one. They all went into a huddle in the back room, and they came out and recommended that Jones be substituted for Martin. They didn't know where Martin was. He disappeared. right after the fraternity was formed, he disappeared. Nobody seems to have been able to find him or know what became of him. Henry Lake Dickinson, who was past general president, told me quietly that he defended himself against a white man, and he had to drop out of school, knife play or something. Now, whether that's so or not, I don't know. But you asked me the question, so I thought I'd tell you. Jones was then substituted as a founder. I was always wondering if he really was a founder, but since Wesley went out there and examined the evidence that was submitted to him, and since a trained historian will only base his conclusions on competent evidence, I wouldn't question it.
Isn't it possible then that there were 9 founders if you count Poindexter and Morton both?
Well,
Or did they just decide they wanted 7?
Poindexter was in the group that became a chapter. He never was in the chapter. Well, when he saw that they were going to organize a fraternity, he withdrew from the group. He was never an alpha. And he just dropped out of the picture, and we never heard anything more from him.
When you went to visit Brother Wesley at Howard, was he a brother then, or how did he become?
Yes.
Oh, okay, I didn't.
One year, Wesley had served as one of my directors under the Go to High School, Go to College campaign. After that program was separated from the office of president, I was the first director of educational activities. And it took 4 years to do it, but I organized the program in 36 states and the District of Columbia with a 9-point full year program. We gave scholarships, we had student loan, we had commission on literature, and I brought something here that I'm not gonna let any of you touch it, but I'm gonna explain it to you. See, because I was Boulay one night, brought some ancient documents and passed them around years ago, and I haven't got them yet. I will show you something here. It may be of interest to you.
I do have a question.
All right.
I'd like to know what emphasis would you most like to see the fraternity take in the future?
What emphasis?
Yes. What direction?
Well, I think in view of its pronouncements that have been made over the years, I think all it has to do is to emphasize them. We believe in full rights of citizenship. We believe in elimination of all the barriers that curtail or hamper us in civil rights. We want everything that we're entitled to as citizens under the Constitution of the United States. Now, according to the accepted usages of Greek letter college societies, we stepped out of line a little bit when we established these public educational programs. And we have a different kind of a Greek letter society than the Caucasian has. Now we have graduate chapters, alumni chapters. They don't. When a Caucasian is initiated into his fraternity, he's a member of that chapter the rest of his life. He keeps active. And that was one reason why they were so able to maintain their chapter houses while most of ours were in debt and had financial trouble. I went to an interfraternity, intersorority council at Columbus, Ohio some years ago, and most of them there were white. There were just a few of our people, students. And I saw an old gray-haired white man coming back to the chapter they belonged to in their undergraduate days. They'd go in the house, they'd look all around to see the changes that had been made, the bunk that they slept in, and so on like that. There's a loyalty that they have that I wish we could capture some of it too. But you see, the first graduate chapter, you call them alumni chapters now, the first one we had was in Louisville, Kentucky, Alpha Lambda. And that was because a number of Alpha men had located there and they got lonesome. And they yearned for the bond of fellowship brotherhood. And so they let the general organization know it, and they authorized the establishment of Alpha Lambda chapter in Louisville, Kentucky. Now you're from Louisville, and you know that. And that chapter had some very fine members. And Frank Stanley, who he's deceased now, he was past general president. He was the editor and publisher of the Louisville Defender. And he was quite a powerful man in that area. He and his son both belonged to Alpha, and he got to be national president. He was a member of that chapter. And who was the man they called Dog Anderson?
Yeah.
He was a member of that chapter and was put in the state legislature in a southern state at a time when thinking about that was almost sacrilege in the northern states. But they did things down in Kentucky, and they had a nice social atmosphere and a beautiful camaraderie. What's next?
You want to show us something?
Oh, yes. I'll tell you, in the 20th convention, out of the last one over which I presided, there was a young man that he was a very astute fellow, and former presidents had not filled up the committees as they should have, and a lot of the undergraduates were left without assignment to any committee. So when I appointed the committees, I appointed everybody at the convention to some committee. And the powerful committee at that time was the recommendations committee. And I put about twice as many on that committee as they ordinarily have, and filled it up full of undergraduate men. They were students, sophomores, juniors, seniors. And the convention was a 5-day convention. They went out in a room to do their committee work. And we were almost ready to adjourn the convention when this committee hadn't reported. And I sent word several times for them to come in, but they didn't come in. So Robert P. Daniel, who was the Eastern Vice President, I asked him to take the chair while I went out to see what the trouble was. So when I went in there, I saw a long table reach from about here to that fireplace. And there were undergraduate men on both sides of the table. And they had books and papers and stacks of periodicals and things stacked up. And they were pouring over all that work. And I thought they're really doing a good job. So I said, what is the reason here that you have reported? We're waiting to adjourn the convention, but we have to have your report in. So there was a tall young man there at the end of the table. He shook his finger at me like that, and he says, we want scholarships. So I looked at him and I said, well, I do too. In fact, that's on my agenda. I said, you're going at this the wrong way. Now you do it this way. Now I'll be presiding. It'll go through. He looked at me. His attitude seemed to say as much, who do you think you are? So I left the room, and that committee came in and reported. And its report was accepted with enthusiasm and they had recommended scholarships. And the General Convention authorized 10 scholarships on that committee's report. And the young man that shook his finger at me was Thurgood Marshall. And years later, I went with him over to the Circuit Court of Appeals. I wanted to hear the argument in the Arkansas teacher salary cases. And the Booker brothers from Little Rock, Arkansas. One was Bob Booker from Little Rock, and the other was William from Chicago. They were both lawyers. And the four of us lawyers went over to the Circuit Court of Appeals. That's federal bench. And we heard the argument. And Thurgood Marshall stood in the Circuit Court of Appeals, immaculately dressed. He had perfect poise. He was master of the situation. His diction was flawless. And the way he presented that case, they won it. And the white lawyers from Arkansas were courteous, and they acknowledged their position, almost their defeat, before the decision was handed down. And Marshall turned around to me on the way over to the courthouse. He said, you remember that 20th convention, Cleveland? I said, yes. You remember we wanted scholarships? I said, yes. He said, well, after that, after you left the room, we called you the big stinker. We said, if you want to get anything in this convention, you got to go see the big stinker. So he still remembered 20 years later, going over to federal court, that I was still the big stinker. Here are the pictures of the 10 scholarships we authorized. One of the man in the top center was blind. He was a Phi Beta Kappa from Western Reserve. And we
Turn it around this way so we can see.
how?
Turn the picture so we can see it.
Oh, yes. I'm not going to let it go because the only one I got. And this is the second year. And with the names up there, I don't remember all the names here, but I have them on another one. Did you get it?
Hold it once more. Yeah.
Did you get this one here?
Right now.
And, you know, it's been a very delightful experience. I never thought when I got into Alpha Phi Alpha that I would be as much involved in it as I have been. But it's been a very interesting tour of duty. I call it duty because these Greek-letter college societies are among our first activist organizations. They actually pointed the way, and they put some of these older organizations to shame. A lot of the women's clubs and similar organizations all over the United States began inaugurating educational campaigns and giving scholarships. And, you know, at the turn of the century, the old order of leadership had failed, and the current courageous leadership was pitifully handicapped. We didn't get to have the dynamic leadership that we needed until Martin Luther King came along. He wasn't any more dynamic than Du Bois, but he had a following that Du Bois didn't have. And Martin Luther King was not only a member of Alpha Phi Alpha, but he's one of the members that we put up in front when we point to an example of this, an example of that. Who's next?
Let me ask a question. There are several conventions now. We've had people lobbying for a yearly convention instead of an annual convention. What is your opinion of that?
Well, we had conventions meeting every 2 years one time. And they got dissatisfied and wanted to meet every year. Our people are, I'll say it this way, the hunger for brotherhood is at the bottom of all the unrest in the world. And our people like social life. They like to come together. They like camaraderie. They like to see each other. The only way they can do that is to meet every year. But I think it'd probably be more economical for them to meet once every 2 years. And the regional conventions usually met in earlier years and the alternate years between the general convention. I'm wondering if the fraternity should be restructured. It's under heavy expense, operating expense. But I haven't had opportunity to go into that like I would like to have done recent years, so I'd hesitate to form any opinion as to it. So I've confined my activities to great measure to the fundamentals and the basics of fraternal endeavor. And I think that we should continue to prepare young men for leadership. And while I'm at it, I want to mention an example. We always say that we're building character into young men, preparing them for leadership. You remember Ernest Green of Brown, Cyrus and Green in Chicago, law firm. Ernest died some years ago. Ernest Green belonged to Xi Lambda chapter in Chicago. And in the days when they had the old chapter house before they got to where the headquarters is now. And Green became a member of the Illinois state legislature. And he was a very astute man, scholarly man. And he developed into a fountain source of information on parliamentary procedure. Now that was something in an Illinois legislature. So one day, one of his white colleagues in the Illinois legislature came to him, as some of them did whenever they had a problem. He said, "How did you come so proficient in parliamentary procedure?" And he drew himself up to his full height. And he said, "I learned all that on the floor of the general convention of my college fraternity, Alpha Phi Alpha." And in those days, the general convention was a great deliberative body where we had a lot of intellectual giants, and we had plenty of them in those days. They took the floor. Now, with a board of directors and an executive committee, they iron out a whole lot of problems in the interim between conventions, and they're not brought up on the floor. But in the earlier years, everything was brought up on the floor. And when you heard Howard Long, Bentley Cyrus, and Walter Jerick, and all of those men get up there, it was more interesting than hearing cases argued before the United States Supreme Court. They were not only able, they were capable, they were astute. Howard Long, I never heard such arguments as he could put up. And most all of that was extemporaneous. They the men of the fraternity in those days were really prepared, and they were leaders.
Jared, White County, too, wasn't it?
Huh?
Jared,
Jerry?
yeah.
Jerry was president of Road Chapter for 30-some years. In Philadelphia, the chapter met in his office after hours. He had a hardwood parquet floor. And in that floor were the letters in hardwood, Alpha Phi Alpha. In the daytime, when patients were coming in and out of the reception room, there was a small rug that covered it. When the meeting was held, when Row Chapter held its meeting in his office, that rug was pulled off. And nobody, if you stepped on the edge of one of those letters, you got called down by Jerry. And Jerry was what you might call the unofficial president of Alpha Phi Alpha. He was from British Guiana. And when the argument would get hot on the convention floor, Jerry had a little story that he'd get up and tell. And everybody got calm and good-natured and laughing, and everything went off fine and smoothly from that time on. He told the experience that he had at Lincoln University. He told how his aunt prepared him down in British Guiana and had a tailor-made suit, and the buttons on the above the vent on the coat, he said, hit him above the gluteal crease. And he said that his trousers were too short for long pants and too long for short pants. And he had them all in good nature, you know. And whenever they'd get to arguing in an animated fashion, he'd get up and tell that story. And then they all got calm.
What was his first name?
Huh?
What was his whole name?
Walter F. Jerrick.
Yeah, I remember those.
But, you remember Brother Isaac's, his good friend? Oh, yeah.
Isaacs was his uncle.
Oh, was that his uncle?
Yes.
I know he used to come visit him out here, Pete.
Well, Isaacs was over Ward Chapel, I think, for a while.
Yeah.
As pastor.
Right.
Now, Isaacs, you know, was comical too,
Yes, he was.
because Norman McGee, when he was general secretary, they never could find a canceled check that he said he'd mailed somebody. And somebody else said they didn't get the check. And he and Homer Cooper always had it, you know. So the argument went along for about a half hour. And Isaacs finally recalled that there had been a train robbery. And the mail car on that train had been robbed. So that's probably where the check, and you know, everything stopped then. It was all smoothed over.
Who was this Alexander from Philadelphia?
Raymond Alexander?
Yeah, Raymond. Yeah, Raymond. Before he was
Raymond Alexander.
Case Alexander.
He took law. He took his college work, University of Pennsylvania. He got to be a tutor, private tutor. Then he went to Harvard and took law. And in that time, the Negro lawyer in Philadelphia was police court lawyer. You know, hang around police court. It might get appointed, or somebody would engage you to go in and represent them. And they didn't have much practice there. So when Raymond Alexander qualified as a lawyer, there was an elderly white lawyer that took him in the office. And after Raymond Alexander got started in the office, this white lawyer was kind enough to die. And he left it all to Raymond Alexander.
He's
And
the
Alexander-
greatest. He's the greatest.
Alexander got
Ever heard in my life.
he went high, wide, and handsome, and he had a lot of business, and he could talk your arm off, and he wasn't afraid of anything, and he'd take cases, you know, that a lot of men would avoid, and he'd win them. So he sort of, his example sort of inspired a lot of the young men in Philadelphia to take law. And in a
Was
few
his wife
years,
a lawyer too?
who?
Yeah.
His wife, was the statistician for the North Carolina Mutual. And after she married Raymond, why, she took law and she became the assistant corporation counsel of the city of Philadelphia.
She was outstanding too.
Yes. In fact, I think she was the brains of the couple. She was far superior to Raymond in intellect. And she was the head of the Delta Sigma Theta sorority. And she tried to work through Raymond to have the Alpha Convention meet where the devils are going to meet. See? So Isaacs got up in New York and wanted to know when Alpha Phi Alpha and Delta Sigma Theta got married. I told him I didn't know because they didn't invite me to the wedding.
So they're the greatest. It'd be such an inspiration to go to these conventions just to listen to all that orator. They go there to deliver.
You know, Emory B. Smith stood on the white Venetian marble rostrum in Abyssinian Baptist Church, December 1924. He delivered the public address. Emory B. Smith was a Congregationalist minister. And he left the ministry and studied law. And he got to be a municipal judge in Washington, D.C. He is the one that gave the address out of the crucible. And during the course of his address, he said Alpha Phi Alpha, not for college, but Alpha Phi Alpha for life. And that pronouncement stands. Before I quit here, I want to show you. This is a copy of Banter's Greek Exchange. It's a catalog of all the fraternities and sororities in America. This issue was put out in March 1919. In the Howard University record, Newman P.G. Adams, former General Secretary of the Alphas, and in later years he was Dean of the Medical School of Howard University. He wrote an article that appeared in the Howard University record, and the editor of Banter's Greek Exchange saw it. And he printed Newman Adams' article verbatim. And that's the first time that Alpha Phi Alpha had national recognition of any kind. He defined a fraternity. He defined it in terms that it will apply to any fraternity, white, black, or red, or so forth. And Newman Adams was a very able man. He used to teach chemistry at Howard. He left and went to Rush Medical. He got qualified, became the dean of the medical school at Howard University. He's dead now. But Banter's Greek Exchange was a catalog of all the fraternities and sororities in America. And Alpha Phi Alpha is mentioned in this. None of the other fraternities composed of men of our race are mentioned in it. I thought you'd like to know that. So, what else is what?
One more question before we go. What advice would you give a brother such as I, who's been in the organization, I guess, no more than 2 years? You've been in 72 years. What advice would you give to the younger Alphas?
Well, you remember when you were initiated? All the instructions that you got? I would tell you, of course, there's sometimes all forms of advice may be worse, but not in this case. I tell you to always keep financial. Attend enough of the chapter meetings to be well posted on the progress that fraternity makes. To go to a general convention now and then whenever you can. And to live up to the tenets of the organization. If you observe the tenets of the preamble of the Constitution, why, you'll be a pretty good man. That's the advice that I would give you. I'll say this too. It ain't the individual, no, the army as a whole, but the everlasting teamwork of every blooming soul. So a good thing to remember, but a better thing to do. You work with the construction gang, not with the wrecking crew.
Old man.
Thank you. I was really, really good.